The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
On Tuesday in Tynwald, the Chief Minister gave a speech outlining the state of the nation. The annual address is a summary of where the current administration sees itself as up to at this point in its term of office, as it enters its third year, the progress that's been made, and the challenges which lie ahead. During his speech, Howard Quayle touched on the economy, government's relationship with the business community, the need to increase support for those struggling with mental health issues, and work on reforming the planning system. He also reflected on the international success of some of the island's sportsmen and women and entertainers, the record A-level results achieved by island students, and the Year of Our Island celebrations. On today's programme, we'll hear parts of that address and discuss some of the issues raised during the sitting with Mr Quayle. And the address started with one of the biggest issues facing both the island and the United Kingdom at the moment: Brexit.
This is the year when Brexit changes from a concept into a reality. One possible outcome is that the UK will leave the EU on the 29th of March without any form of a deal. There is still a huge amount of work that needs to be done to make sure that the Isle of Man is totally prepared for that scenario, and indeed for all scenarios. This is one of the greatest challenges that a Manx government and Parliament has ever faced. Our European Union and Trade Bill, which will come to the Keys for its first reading later this month, is probably the most important piece of legislation that this Honourable Court will need to consider in a generation. We simply don't know whether there will be a deal or not. There are many critical issues that are still unresolved. The EU will not allow free movement of goods without free movement of people. The UK does not want a physical border in Ireland, and it does not want free movement of people. After all, this was one of the key drivers behind the vote for Brexit in the first place. If you had asked me about the likelihood of a deal before the Salzburg conference, I would have said with some confidence that I think they will find a way through. But as we saw, the summit did not go to plan. The signs are now improving, and I'm picking up more of a note of optimism. But we have to remember that this is a difficult time, both technically and politically, especially politically. And we know that there are still difficulties on the UK side, as well as within the Northern Irish MPs, which means that any deal may not get the backing it needs in Parliament. The UK and the EU both need to agree and sign off the withdrawal agreement, with a workable backstop on Northern Ireland, as well as the broad scope of a high-level political declaration which will set out the future relationship. We are entering a crucial stage, and we will hopefully see some detail emerge at the end of this week, with further scope for final sign-off in November. This means that the negotiations will be intense over the next 2 to 3 weeks. But I want to make sure that what I say next is totally clear. Deal or no deal, we are making the necessary preparations so that we are ready, whatever happens, and we will have made the necessary preparations for either scenario. Because we are small and agile, we will be ready to take advantage of post-Brexit opportunities. And because we have planned meticulously for any outcome, we will be as well prepared as possible. I have always said that when I finish my political career, I want to leave the island in a better position than when I started.
So, you gave your State of the Nation address. To your mind, is the nation doing well at the moment? Is this administration succeeding?
Well, first and foremost, I don't want to sound in any way, and government cannot be complacent. There are so many off-island events that can impact on the island's prosperity that we've got to work on, and I think I rattled them off in the State of the Nation, money value, code of conduct, group beneficial ownership, tax-free, to name but a few. But where we are at the moment, we are probably ahead of where I hoped we would be, with a surplus for the first time in 10 years in the revenue account, the growth in GDP, the growth in the amount of money coming into the pockets of the average person on the street. And I appreciate some people won't see that, and some people might see a greater amount, but those are the official figures. I'm not going to argue with them, but as I say, a significant increase in GDP, but we're not going to achieve that every year. This was a pretty good year, but yeah, we are. I'm really pleased with where we are, but there's an awful lot more. There's an awful lot of hard work being done, but there's an awful lot more to be done if we're to fulfil our 5-year plan.
Now, you mentioned some of the challenges internationally, but of course the big one at the moment is Brexit. That's something you've been looking at very closely, and you've been leading on that one. You said in your address that the Isle of Man is taking steps to be prepared for whatever outcome, whether there's a deal or it's a no-deal scenario. Can you really prepare for any scenario when you just don't know?
No, you can't prepare for every scenario. I did allude to that in my speech. We are as well prepared as is possible, was I think a phrase I used, because we send over, it's not just myself that goes over, the officers in, say, DEFRA, meet DEFRA in the UK. It's the same with our Attorney General's officers. They go over and meet their UK counterpart, but we build up really good working relationships where we find out the latest thinking. We've been getting the technical notes from the UK government on where they see a no-deal scenario, what will impact on them, and then we look at it from our point of view and we prepare the same scenario on the Isle of Man. Some areas won't affect us, some areas will, and what can we do to be as well prepared? So we have a really good working relationship with the UK government and the civil service across, and therefore we are as well updated as we possibly can be, and therefore we are preparing now. I hope there is a form of deal, but I think I mentioned before, if you go into the First Sea Lord's office in London, above the door is the Latin phrase which translates to, if you want peace, prepare for war. So we've had to prepare for a no-deal scenario. If there is a deal, then obviously there will be the 21 month period of a further implementation period for us to implement whatever deal is reached, but we've got to be as well prepared as possible. Of course we can't be prepared for every single eventuality, but the EU and trade bill that I'm taking through the House of Keys on the 23rd of October will have its first reading. That has been as well drafted to allow, there are a number of clauses that allow, if certain events happen, the legislation, the way it's written, will enable us to make the changes with secondary legislation quick, rather than having to go out with primary legislation, which can take a while, and which, and in that time you might have a black hole where we've got no procedures and our businesses are at a disadvantage, and we can't allow that to happen.
Now, we've heard today that there could be a further delay as if no agreement is reached over the Irish border. That's essentially piling uncertainty on top of an uncertain situation. I mean, is that likely to cause more problems for the Isle of Man in terms of business confidence and stability here in the Isle of Man?
Well, I'd be highly surprised if that goes ahead, because you've got to get the whole of the EU to agree to that first, and even if you get it agreed in the EU, you've then got to get it agreed in Westminster. So there was always, I fully expected that to be mooted, along with a number of other issues that I think will happen. There's an awful lot of sabre rattling and sensational stories designed to people, to get people's attention, but I doubt we'll ever come to anything. We've just got to wade through that and carry on making sure that the Isle of Man is as well prepared as possible. And we've been going out giving talks to businesses to reassure them about the changes that we're making, that we will be ready on time, so that whether Brexit happens on the 29th of March at 11 o'clock 2019 or a year later or whatever, we on the Isle of Man are as well prepared and well informed as possible. The cornerstone of this administration is sustainability. We have continued to deliver the programme for government to make the Isle of Man an even more special place to live and work. I will not steal the thunder from my colleague Minister Thomas, who will return to this court next month for a debate on the programme for government. But I would emphasise that we remain committed to delivering our three core aims: an inclusive and caring society, an island of enterprise and opportunity, and a financially responsible government. We are focusing on achieving some very specific outcomes in the programme for government. One of the actions set out in the programme was to ensure the future security, sustainability and reliability of our sea and air routes. We now own our strategic sea services. After an enormous amount of careful consideration, the Council of Ministers decided, in the best interests of our residents, in the best interests of our businesses, and in the best long-term interests of the Isle of Man as a whole, that we would take control of the future of our ferry service. We listened to the concerns of the public, and with the support of Tynwald, we took action. And that has secured sustainability on our seas for many years to come.
Now, you also touched on sea and air services and sustainability of those services. We know that a deal's been done to buy the steam packet company and thereby securing the strategic sea routes. Are there any plans to do a similar thing for air routes? Because at the moment, that's, to use a phrase, up in the air.
Well, it is up in the air, I suppose, Catherine. And yeah, you should always look and review your policies as you go along. And behind the scenes, we do refresh our policies, and we will, I'm sure, be having a glance again at where we go with some of our skies policies. Is our current policy right? Do we need to review it? You know, these are things you should do as a matter of course all the time, and where we think there may be problems, then, you know, can we come up with a backup plan to ensure the good links are maintained and that there's a good quality service, which is even more important.
Now, would you do anything? Would you invest in it more? Would you take a stronger hold on air routes, for instance, investing in an airline?
Well, I think if you look at the Guernsey model, they're losing a significant, quite a few £1 million a year. I don't know, it's 8 to 10 million a year off the top of my head, don't quote me on that, where they're losing money with operating their own airline. So I think our residents would quite rightly be unimpressed with this administration if we found ourselves in that scenario. But equally, we have to ensure that we have good connectivity for people to get off and meet with family, and businesses to get off and have the onward connections. So it's something the Minister of DOI and his team are looking at and comb in, check on and comment on behind the scenes from time to time.
Our investment in infrastructure will have benefits for many future generations. Planning is in for Lord Street, with an intention to build a new hotel, a 7-screen cinema, restaurants and parking. And ending many years of prevarication, work has finally begun on the promenade. Yes, it is going to be a little bit more difficult for us to get around Douglas over the next 2 years, but this work will benefit the island for many decades to come. A deal has been signed with Peel Holdings to build a new ferry terminal in Liverpool. And we spent a few extra months negotiating the details so that we could get the best possible deal for the Isle of Man. But it's not just our physical environment where we have made sustainable decisions. We took the decision to write off £95 million of debt from Manx Utilities, scaling down proposed significant price increases, and therefore helping every resident of the Isle of Man. In fact, we are always looking to help those people in our society on low income. Writing off this debt also meant that the MUA could realistically plan for the future. This sensible and robust new pricing structure is laid ready for discussion with members later in the sitting. It is a structure that I wholeheartedly support. Socrates once said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." None of these important decisions have been easy, and quite rightly there has been debate. But ultimately, Mr. President, this honourable court has worked together for the greater good of the Isle of Man. I have set up a Chief Minister's Committee to look into the policy for gas regulation on the island, and I am delighted that the Minister for Policy and Reform will be reporting back to me in December. And also laid before the court today is our telecommunications strategy. This is an area in which we used to lead the world, but we have now fallen to 62nd place for the speed of our network. If we want to maintain and grow our digital economy and our associated industries like fintech and digital health, then we have to have the right infrastructure.
Now, if we move on to development, we've seen moves towards the start of the promenade redevelopment or refurbishment. That's a major project that's been on the cards for well over a decade now. It's been talked about. It's going to be done in, they say, 2 years. Is it being done too quickly? We know that the walkway itself isn't going to be worked on, but the promenade carriageway is. Should there be a more comprehensive plan for that area?
Well, I think it's fair to point out, because there has been criticism of DOI and why can't you do it quicker. And if we shut the promenade, we could do it probably in half the time, but we have to ensure that you can have 2 lanes of traffic in and out along the promenade to enable businesses to carry on as normal that are on the promenade, and the flow of traffic in and out of Douglas. An awful lot of the north traffic comes in through Urkel on the promenade. It would gridlock Douglas if we shut it down in a short period of time. So I think that the DOI have looked at how can we do the massive improvements to the promenade without damaging business and the flow of traffic. And I think that their plan that they've come up with, I'm very hopeful it will work. But, it's not going to be perfect. There will be times when people, I'm sure, and I mentioned that in my speech, it's not going to be quite as good as it is now. But when it's finished, it will make significant improvements to the first thing you see when you get off the boat is a promenade. And one that's a major improvement for not just the people coming to the Isle of Man, but also for the residents of the Isle of Man. It's long overdue. It'll have the latest infrastructure. The drains will be fixed underneath. Potholes will hopefully be a thing of the past. And there's also work extending the height of the seawall in places.
You mentioned the Lord Street development, the plans there. Quite ambitious plans for that area. Again, it's been empty for quite a long time now. There's been a lot of talk of developing that site. But it is reliant on private sector investment. It is said that it could be the catalyst for more developments in Douglas, but surely that's reliant on business confidence and confidence in investing in the Isle of Man. And when there is so much uncertainty, are you confident that that's going to happen?
Well, I think if you see the surveys, Catherine, that the Department for Enterprise have carried out, business confidence in the Isle of Man is growing. We've seen a major reinvestment in what was the Mount Murray. It's now the Comus, where multi-million-pound investment there. The redevelopment of the prom is obviously taxpayers' money, but there are, the Lord Street site. The Lord Street site is one of many that I know about where private businesses are looking to invest considerable amounts of money to redevelop sites across the whole of the island, and I think that's the business community's show of confidence in the island.
Now, also during the Tynwald sitting, we saw the telecom strategy debated. You mentioned that in your State of the Nation address as well. Telecommunications in the island have severely fallen behind, some would say, at a time when you're trying to push forward ICT, fintech. How have they become so out of kilter in the Isle of Man?
Well, I suppose it has to be in investment. I don't want to get too critical. It's happened. We're now 62nd in the world for megabits per second download speed on your broadband. That can't be good enough. Some areas are really good, I hasten to add, but when we're wanting to grow our economy, grow our businesses, the workforce on the Isle of Man, so that government has the income to enable it to have sustainable policies for paying for health and social care as examples going forward, then we have to have good connectivity across the whole of the island. The likes of Jersey have spent significant amounts of money and are way ahead of us, and it's something we find ourselves in a position where we need to make big changes. I'm delighted that Tynwald has supported myself and the committee and the Council of Ministers with the changes that we're recommending. It was unanimous in Tynwald. I was delighted with that, and I think it's really important that if we want to keep our young people on the island and attract more people to the Isle of Man, then we have to have better facilities for everyone. So, and digital, the communications around the whole of the island as one, better facilities. So the multiplex cinemas, a new restaurant, hotel, multi-storey car park, new promenade, and the number of other major developments that are being announced. All these added together, along with 100% increase in the approval of the way work permits are now handled, with a turnaround 90% within 24 hours. All this, it's like a multi-pronged approach to helping to grow our economy, keep our young people or get them back in the future, and, as I say, grow our skilled workforce on the Isle of Man.
But it's a 5-year strategy. Everything seems to be a 5-year strategy these days. Is 5 years quick enough? I mean, in 5 years' time, the jurisdictions who are ahead already are likely to be further ahead again, possibly even with new technologies. Should this process be speeded up?
Well, we've come up with a 5-year strategy, and we will wait to see what the bids are in for the people who are going to be providing this technology. If they come back and hypothetically say, well, for an extra £5 million we can shave 2 years off this, then it may well be that when you sit down and work out the benefits of shaving a year or two off this to the economy, then that's money well spent. Then I would hope that we would do that. So I'm as keen as the next person to have this done in as quick a period as possible. But let's wait and see what DfE come back with once they've successfully tendered with the telecommunications sector on the Isle of Man, to see what can be delivered.
We'll continue our conversation with Chief Minister Howard Quayle about the annual State of the Nation address after the break.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
At the October sitting of the Tynwald Court, the Chief Minister made his annual State of the Nation address, focusing on the progress made by his administration as it starts its 3rd year in office and the challenges ahead. And on this week's programme, we're in conversation with Howard Quayle about some of those issues raised during the speech and during the questions from members afterwards. We'll return to that conversation shortly, but first, Mr Quayle's comments about the government's relationship with the island's business community.
In the business arena, we are making real and lasting reforms. Business told us that work permits were not working. So we fundamentally reformed our work permit regime. The new system provides a balance between supporting employers and the need to protect our Manx workers. As a result, overall business confidence in the system has doubled, and over 90% of all permits are now approved within 24 hours. Business told us that planning needed to be reformed, so we consulted on a wide range of reforms, and back in May, a plan to reform the planning system was laid before this Honourable Court. A fundamental change to the Town and Country Planning Bill is currently out for consultation. The bill proposes a number of key changes, including national policy directives and community infrastructure levies. Business told us that we needed to make it easier to work with government. So we reformed the Department for Enterprise, setting up the delivery agencies so that we can work more closely with those at the coalface. As a result, we have improved the way we communicate with business. But we still need to improve our communication with the public. We want to build on openness and transparency. We know that every day more and more people want to access information and services online and through social media. The way that people receive information is constantly changing, and they may not always want to hear what politicians have to say. We have to constantly improve our ability to convey information in a clear and simple way to all audiences, especially younger audiences.
There's a lot of talk in your address in your speech about working with business and improving relations with business. There are accusations that the government and possibly the Council of Ministers is far too cosy with the likes of the Chamber of Commerce, potentially to the detriment of those living in the community. Do you give the same level of credence to the public's views as you do to the business community in the Isle of Man, or is your focus on growing that economy?
Well, of course we listen to the views of the people, and the people tell us they want a well-run health service, they want a well-run social care system, they want well-run prisons, police force, fire brigade, roads, but all of that comes at a cost. And too many times I think people make promises that they're going to deliver all of this, but how is it going to be paid for? Yes, we have reserves, but half of our reserves are allocated for state pensions, for example. So where is the money going to come from? No matter how well intentioned you are as a politician, if you have not got the money coming into Treasury, you cannot afford to pay the bill for healthcare, social care and all the other areas that the people want on the Isle of Man. So it's a partnership, and I think people have to accept that if we are not a business-friendly island, we will not have the money coming in to pay for all the services that the people of this island want. And I want to provide, the services that the people want. But this administration and Tynwald is all, because Tynwald has signed up to this, it's all about sustainable long-term policies, and we've got to make sure that we work with business. We've got to be, we can't be run by business, but of course we've got to listen to their concerns, and where we think they're being reasonable, that there are areas where we haven't got it right, we need to listen to them and make those changes so that we can have the income levels coming in to provide the services we want for the people of the island.
And some of those services are sewerage, water and electricity, and there was a 5-year pricing plan or pricing structure approved by Tynwald this month as well. Electricity is possibly in a slightly different basket, but certainly when it comes to water and sewerage, the MUA say they want to create certainty and stability for both businesses and domestic customers in the Isle of Man. But when those prices are linked to a system which is seen as fundamentally unfair and outdated in terms of the rating system in the Isle of Man, is that really fair?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you look at the review and the changes that the MUA have made, they are now going to be charging a fair price for their water. I think the water side of things had been bringing in more than it was costing, but the sewage wasn't covering, the income coming in wasn't covering the actual cost, so that is making it a fairer amount. It's worth noting that no matter what you do with rates, you will always be replacing one unfair system with another unfair system. You're never going to get utopia. What we are trying to do is trying to reduce the amount, to reduce the unfairness and make it as fair as we possibly can. And this is something that people have been looking at for 40 years. If it was a simple thing to do, it would have been done a long time ago. But we have given a commitment that we will do our absolute best to ensure that we have a modernisation of the rates review, and that's something that's been worked on.
Sustainability is also at the heart of our policies for the environment. We remain the only jurisdiction with UNESCO biosphere status. This is an accolade that even the Guardian newspaper couldn't ignore. The Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture recently announced 9 new marine nature reserves, bringing the total up to 10. The reserves will cover over 10% of the island's territorial sea and more than 50% of the inshore waters that contain the highest diversity of species and habitats. Over the past year, we have given Beach Buddies funding to help their magnificent work of clearing plastic from our beaches and footpaths.
And when it comes to the environment, you mentioned the island's UNESCO biosphere status, you mentioned the 9 new marine nature reserves, which takes the island's total up to 10 and meets its targets on that front. And you also mentioned the work of Beach Buddies and the government support for that. What you didn't mention was climate change and steps that the government might be taking to mitigate for that. Is it something that you don't see as important?
No, I do see it as important, and we're working on that all the time. Minister Boot and his team in DEFRA have a plan. They're looking at taking changes. We've got a new island strategy on plastics and single-use plastics and how we deal with that going forward. I know I might as well raise it myself before someone else does. There's criticism about government putting out the licensing for the gas exploration off the north of the island. Now, UNESCO Biosphere allows administrations who have UNESCO Biosphere status to use their natural resources, so that A, it doesn't go against UNESCO Biosphere requirements, but B, there's an awful lot of people saying we don't want shale fracking on the Isle of Man. That's not the system. If subject to a series of approvals where our environment will have to be maintained, and we don't want any damage doing to it. They will be extracting, if they find gas, there's a presumption there, with a method that has currently been used for the last 20 years, because where our seabed is, where they think the gas may be, it's sandstone, not shale. So we won't be fracking in shale like is being proposed in the northwest of the UK. What if they find something, the process going ahead will be something that has been going on for the last 20 years in British waters.
But should there be more emphasis on turning away from using fossil fuels, even if they are natural resources for the Isle of Man? Should there be more of a focus on renewables?
Absolutely, and that's something, I'm an ex-chair of in my day it was the MEA, and we were looking at tidal power off the north of the island at the Point of Ayre, especially now. Unfortunately, the company that had private money didn't carry on. Whether it's financially at this moment in time financially effective to go down that route, especially with the UK withdrawing their ROCs, which was a subsidy that they gave for this sort of work. But I spoke to the Metro Mayor of Liverpool when I was over at the Liverpool Party Conference, and they are working on technology in Liverpool in their seabed to do this sort of work, because they've got a big rise and fall in their tides in the Mersey. So if they do that sort of technology, say in 20 years' time, when our gas turbines are coming to the end of their useful life, that's when we can look at developing this. And if we find gas, then I would hope that some of the royalties from a future administration, because I don't think it'll happen in my time, will put that money aside and say, right, that when we're looking at replacing our gas turbines, and you have to say that gas, of all of the natural fossil fuels, coal and wood, etc., is the cleanest technology. We have about another 20 years of life left in our electricity generation plants using the gas turbines, and when that comes to the end of its life, I would genuinely hope that the technology we can have 100% of our electricity generation on the Isle of Man could be totally green, and I think that would enable us to comply with the commitment given that the government has given, previous administration has given, to comply with emissions for 2050.
There's one thing that has been mentioned by the Manx National Farmers Union is across the water, farmers have the opportunity to create energy through solar panels, and there isn't the opportunity to do that here.
At the moment there isn't. You can never say never. I think there was an amendment on the floor of Tynwald that asked the MUA to look at a report into people generating their own electricity going into the grid. So let's see what that comes up with.
There has also been significant achievements in our economy. Our GDP in real terms has increased by 7.4%. The amount of money people take home in their pocket has increased by 4.4%. Whilst we cannot expect growth like this every year, Mr. President, I believe that we are heading in the right direction. And when I talk about sustainability, I don't just mean in our environment. I also mean in our society. We are rolling out the Equality Act, part of our commitment to an inclusive and caring society, from the 1st of January 2019. There will be wider protection for all members of our society, ensuring equal treatment when accessing services or in employment. As an employer, the government has introduced the living wage and is committed to increasing the pay for 86 public services, commission and healthcare workers to the living wage of £8.61 per hour. Members will hear more about this shortly from the Minister for Policy and Reform. And Minister Thomas is also looking to see how we can help those who are cold, hungry or homeless. But I think we still need to do more than this. I have asked the Minister for Health and Social Care, Minister Ashford, to chair a new Chief Minister's Committee to look carefully at the issues faced by those on 0 hours contracts. This is something that I've been concerned about for some time. I know that some workers, like those in the care industry or those in seasonal work, rely on this type of contract. But we need to ensure that they are not being abused by employers.
Now, one thing that was mentioned, certainly during the questions and answers after the address itself, was the public sector pensions deficit and work that's been done to address. MLC David Cretney asked you, would you acknowledge the work done to build up the reserves in the first place to put the Isle of Man in the place it's in at the moment, where it's able to do things like buy the steam packet company and help to address things like the public sector pensions issue? Do you concede that that work was vital to the island's position today? Or do you disagree with that viewpoint?
Well, I think history will judge the many administrations that David Cretney was a part of, and history will judge the Quayle administration, I suppose, for want of a better word. I think the State of the Nation speech is not a look back in history. It's about what's happening at the moment, what has the current administration achieved, what its plans are going forward, and giving an update, sort of setting the scene for the coming year. It's not either an attack or a defence of previous administrations. So you don't, I didn't plan on discussing previous administrations, not because I'm anti them, but because the State of the Nation is, as I say, is giving an update on where we are now and where we're going forward. And yes, there are reserves that have been built up by previous administrations, but there's sometimes people choose the bits they like. Most of the changes that we've made weren't reserve necessary, but the two big areas where they were reserve, where we needed the reserves, was obviously to buy the steam packet. That was one, and it was great that we had funds there. And I think the last administration did an awful lot of work to stabilising the deficit, the spend of what was going out and what was coming in. There was a massive gap in 2011, and it has been reducing, and it's my aim to carry on that work, and at the end of this administration have that down to as little as possible, where we're not having to use reserves or interest on reserves. But if I might be bold to say that the 95 million written off by the MUA, for example, which Treasury did to ensure that we didn't put the prices up. We will be putting the prices up by inflation rather than big jumps to fund the debt that the MEA built up at the time, and a previous administration, which I think he was a member of at the time, allowed that to happen. So it's I'm not here to judge previous administrations. All I'm trying to do is giving members an update of where we are and what we've achieved.
Another item that came up was 0 hours. It's a bit of a bone of contention in a lot of places. It gets a lot of coverage, a lot of publicity, and is seen as a very bad thing. But you're almost on the fence on this at the moment?
Well, I have had concerns personally as a backbencher, and now that I'm Chief Minister, about 0 hours. I see there is a need for 0 hours, and I support in principle 0 hours for certain areas. So I'm not saying I want to do away with it. I just want to make that clear. However, I am concerned that there may be abuses out there. We haven't done any work into investigating that. So if you're coming to the end of your career and you want to carry on maybe doing a bit of part-time work whilst you do more travelling, etc., then 0 hours is fantastic. If you're maybe a student looking to do some bar work, happens in my family with my children, then a bit of 0 hours work, fantastic. But if you're the main breadwinner in a family unit, and 1 minute you've got 30 hours and the next week you've got 7, and that's to suit your boss who's making a nice profit out of it, then that's totally unfair. And all I'm saying is that let's look at the issue and say, is it being abused? Let's get some data together, and if it's being abused, what can we do to protect the people who are vulnerable, maybe the lower income levels, and put in changes to give them protection, but while still allowing it for those sectors of parts of the community who see 0 hours as very useful to them. So nothing's been done before, and I think it's a tough one to look at, but it needed to be looked at, and I'm delighted that the committee has already been set up. I've asked Minister Ashford to chair it because his department is the biggest user of 0 hours in the health service. Then I've asked a member from Treasury to come on the committee, because obviously there are areas where maybe benefits, I get allegations that certain employers will employ people part-time for less than a certain number of hours so that they don't have to pay national insurance contributions for their employers. So there could be abuses there that we need to look at. So Mr. Bill Henderson will be coming on that committee. Then Department for Enterprise is there to look after business interests, and Mr. Hooper, who's a member of the Department for Enterprise, he will be on the committee to bring, to cover that element. And then from the Cabinet Office, because we are where our OHR is based for government, is in our Cabinet Office, Dr. Allinson will be on the committee to work together under Minister Ashford to have a really good look at this, take evidence and give a report back to me, which will go to Comyn and then on to Tynwald. So I'm delighted that we've been able to hit the ground running, and that everyone who has been asked to take part on the committee has accepted straight away and keen to see what can be done. So I'm not saying something definitely will happen, because we can't prejudge what the committee find and the evidence they come up with, but we are having a look, because anecdotal evidence that I receive is that there are a small number of employers who are abusing this, but I have a feeling that the majority of employers are not abusing it. So it's just looking at it to make sure, can we improve it to look after the people if there is an abuse in certain areas.
And if there is found to be any abuses of the system, would you go so far as to legislate against it?
Yes, but I don't want to prejudge the report and what evidence. There are no. I've not said you must do this and you've got to say that to the committee. They are going out to investigate and report back. So let's wait and see what the committee come up with. But if they come up with an abuse and Council of Ministers and then Tim will support it, then I would expect to see changes. But let's not preempt what they find.
Mr. President, in summary, the government is well placed to continue delivering sustainability for the Isle of Man. But we are not complacent. We have a lot more work to do. And we are still facing significant international challenges. Tax 3, Moneyval, the EU Code of Conduct Group, and the debate over beneficial ownership still goes on. In all good organisations, you have the front of house team and you have the behind the scenes team. Without both, you won't succeed. And I would like to thank all of our public sector workers for their valuable work and the contribution they make to the Isle of Man every day. Mr. President, we will continue down the path of delivering sustainable policies at home and meeting international standards abroad. We will make the most of every opportunity that we can find in the post-Brexit world, and we will continue to make the right decisions for the present and for the future of this most special and proud island nation, a truly special place to live and work. We will make absolutely certain that the Isle of Man will always be a shining jewel in the Irish Sea.
Now, you mentioned at the start, we touched on at the start on Brexit and the challenges that it could pose, but you mentioned the other international challenges facing the Isle of Man. Again, much like Brexit, things that are essentially out of your control because it's decisions made by other people. Beneficial ownership being one of them, and perceived VAT loopholes being another. How damaging could changes made in other places be to the Isle of Man?
Well, obviously the beneficial ownership, we've said to the UK government that should it become an international standard, then the Isle of Man will of course comply with that when it becomes an international standard. At the moment, the United Kingdom is the only country in the world that has a public register of beneficial ownership. We have a register of beneficial ownership, but it's private, but it's regularly updated, it's well regulated, there are proper fines, from a cash fine being struck off to ending up in prison if you put misleading information on that register. We share it with the UK government. It's not a public one, but it is there and it's well documented. It's there within 24 hours of a normal request, or 1 hour if it's a terrorism concern. Moneyval, which I mentioned, we've had our assessment. There were areas where we were proven to be not as good as where we should be. We've been uprated on 8 of our measures, so we are working in the right direction. We avoided being blacklisted by the EU, and we gave a commitment that we would have changes in place by the end of this year, and we're working with the EU Code of Conduct Group at this moment in time. So there's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes to ensure that the Isle of Man successfully steers its way through some very choppy waters at the moment. But so an awful lot of them we can, by working hard and making the changes, they are in our control to an extent. But Brexit is not in our control for the outcome. We just have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we are as well prepared as possible.
Chief Minister Howard Quayle. And you can listen to the whole of that State of the Nation address on the Tynwald website. You'll find a link to that on the Sunday opinion page of manxradio.com. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be back at the same time next week. But in the meantime, have a very good afternoon.